for this particular topic. And I cannot wait to kickstart this. But of course, before we begin, I do want to mention that I am joining from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And as part of Canada's history and ongoing work towards reconciliation, we acknowledge Canada's First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples, their histories and contributions throughout Canada. So this is obviously no surprise. Several women have been impacted by economic abuse, many without realizing or recognizing that it is economic abuse. And the impact and effects on women has risen exponentially since COVID-19. So what is our position in economic abuse as a nation? How are we going to tackle this moving forward? And what roles are organizations and support services playing in tackling this and moving the agenda along with economic abuse? So please join me in welcoming Erin Whitmore, who is the Executive Director at Ending Violence Association of Canada, Paola Johnny Morgan, who is the Manager of Equity Promotions at METRAC. We have Liren Doctry, who is the Manager of Programs at Women Abuse Council of Toronto, Neha Shahzad, who's on the board of directors, and of course, the policy and research lead for the Canadian Centre of Women's Empowerment. And last but not least, we have Valentina Cardona, who is the Women's Counselor at the Interval House of Ottawa. So thank you so much for being here for this very important discussion. I want to kickstart this conversation by asking a very simple question. There isn't enough information out there that I have seen on economic abuse. It's not very well heard of. It's not, a lot of individuals are not aware of the term economic abuse because it's not much information is out there on the term. So what is economic abuse? And I want to ask Liren, Neha, and Erin, what does it mean? So if you don't mind, Liren, to kind of kickstart this for us.
Sure. So economic abuse and financial abuse are sometimes used interchangeably, or you'll also see, of course, financial abuse is considered one form of economic abuse. Economic abuse can be any behavior or a system that aims to obviously control someone's ability to gain or use economic resources. In the context today, it is often a common tactic used by abusers to both isolate women, but also prevent women from being financially independent. It can take many different forms. Practically speaking, some examples, it could be withholding financial information from a partner, limiting or deciding how much a partner can spend. It could be excluding a partner from important financial decisions, taking money from a partner. Also, it could be not being paid when working for a family business. It could be preventing a partner from working or making it very difficult for them to work, whether it's harassing them at work or starting an argument ahead of their partner's job. I think it's just important to kick off also to recognize that when we look at economic abuse, if we apply a gendered lens to it, it of course looks different. Financial abusive behaviors can be considered normal because of gendered roles and norms related to money, family and relationships. There's a traditional view, obviously, and practice of men handling the finances. So I think it's really important in our conversation to also recognize that when you apply a gendered lens to it financially, we need to do that because financially controlling tactics can appear to sometimes be very normal or kind of financial arrangements or disagreements between partners.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up, Liren, and just in terms of ensure that there's a gender lens kind of focus put in when it comes to economic abuse. Thank you so much. Neha.
Yeah, just to add on to what Liren said, I think she covered most of it. But I will say that economic abuse has three components to it, and that's economic exploitation, economic control, and employment sabotage. And like Liren was saying, financial abuse and economic abuse are interchangeably used, but financial abuse refers to the first two parts of these, which is economic control, and that includes things like restricting access to finances, refusing to contribute financially for necessities, and controlling household spending. And then economic exploitation sounds exactly like what it is. Misusing family finances, damaging someone's property, or damaging or stealing someone's property or identity, or putting someone into debt. So those two are what financial abuse encompasses. And then economic abuse also includes employment sabotage. So restricting access to work or access to education. And the only thing else I would add, along with the gendered lens, is also that economic abuse tends to typically have an increased impact on women who are visible minorities, Black women, Indigenous, and of course those of the LGBTQ community, and immigrants and refugees.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. One, it's great that Lear needed as well is providing us the difference between financial and economic abuse, and also showing ways on how they intertwine. And also Neha to kind of provide a more in-depth lens into economic abuse and how BIPOC community and the LGBTQ2S community, and of course newcomers, are also impacted by it on different variation and different level as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Sorry, Erin.
Great, thanks everyone, and thanks Liren and Neha for setting that up. I think you've covered a lot about the defining sort of the difference between financial and economic abuse. But I think that, taking this time today to really kind of shine a light on the issue of economic and financial abuse is important when we're thinking about gender-based violence more broadly, because economic and financial abuse often occurs alongside other forms of violence, such as sexual violence or intimate partner violence. It sometimes kind of gets lost in the bigger discussions that we have around this issue. So it's good to be kind of taking a look at exactly what we mean by these terms in our discussion today. I think with economic and financial abuse, and thinking about the way that it limits access to economic resources, I mean, it's one of the biggest barriers for someone who is trying to leave an abusive relationship, and whether that abuse is economic or some other form of abuse. And then we also know that experiencing economic or financial abuse and the impacts that it can have on someone's ability to secure housing, employment, meet their basic needs, can then make them more vulnerable or more at risk for additional forms of violence. So for me, thinking about economic and financial abuse is kind of interconnected with all of these other forms of violence is really important. The other thing I would say too, when we're thinking about economic abuse as kind of a bit of a broader umbrella term, and I think Liren, you alluded to this, that we can also kind of extend our analysis beyond just what this looks like between individuals to also kind of think about the way freedoms of individuals or certain groups of people. And that's really important when we're thinking about how certain groups of women, racialized women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, can experience additional forms of an economic precarity because of the ways that the systems and structures that we live in work.
Thanks so much, Erin. So I want to take us back a little bit, actually a lot of it, because we're in month 8 or 7, I don't know now. So as an organization that used to work directly with the women and used to provide in-person support for victims of abuse, Valentina, Lyra, and Erin, I wanted to kind of get your 2 cents on this. What have been and what were some of your concerns when COVID-19 hit? So Erin, if you want to kickstart this.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So certainly, I mean, when the pandemic started in early March, I think everyone who's working in the gender-based violence sector was immediately concerned about the way that the pandemic what it would mean in terms of its impacts for those who are experiencing or who are at risk of violence and abuse, as well as its impact on the services that support survivors. We knew that many of the measures that were being put in place to manage the health impacts of the pandemic, such as being isolated at home and physical distancing, all of those were likely to increase the risk for all forms of violence, and that would include economic abuse. And you know, certainly many of the tactics that are common to that are used to commit economic and financial abuse, you know, such as isolating someone or using intimidation or coercion or threats, became a lot easier under these conditions. The Ending Violence Association of Canada and ANOVA, which is a sexual assault and domestic violence center based in London, Ontario, we conducted a national survey that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on gender-based violence services and survivors. And certainly one of the things we found were that there was a shift in the tactics that were being used to commit violence, where abusers were really taking advantage of the conditions that were created by the pandemic to exert or escalate abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to add on to that, for us as a shelter for women who are experiencing violence, it was the isolation for sure that we were very scared about. So isolation is already something that women experience. And in this case, we were told to stay in our homes. There was nothing that was opened at the start of the pandemic. So they were forced to stay in their homes. This makes it much more difficult for women to communicate with other outside services or people that they trust. So then that isolation was really, really heightened. And like Erin said, this will increase the types of abuse that women will experience. So abuse usually increases in high stress situations. The pandemic brought in so much stressors for everybody. So with a person that is dealing already with the abuse, and then you on top of this add all the uncertainty that has come with the pandemic. There was so many more crisis calls that we have experienced since the pandemic started, such an increase for shelter space. Even still today, we have a person that leaves, by the next day there's somebody that will fill that room. So absolutely, we definitely see that. It's so much harder to leave a relationship. You don't have as much time to plan for it. You can't freely call the services and make a safety plan with them. Making a safety plan was very difficult with some women because their partner was in the other room. So to try to get those small moments where they could actually step out and talk to us, it was really difficult, and we are still struggling with that for sure.
Thanks, Valentina, for sharing that your kind of the experiences of the organization as well. Yeah, I can't imagine. I think that was one of the biggest concerns, as you mentioned, that was brought on by the pandemic. So thanks for sharing that, Liren.
Yeah, no, I can't reiterate enough Erin and Valentina's points. I also think, back to Erin's point that she made earlier, one of our concerns obviously is kind of the long-term impact of the pandemic on women's economic security, and then what this means for their safety, right? Because as Erin pointed out, violence against women and women's economic security are so deeply connected, right? The economic insecurity can marginalize women, increases their risk of victimization, but then a lack of access to resources or financial independence can then prevent a woman from leaving an abusive situation. So we know that both violence against women has been increased during the pandemic, but we also know that this has been dubbed a she-cession, right? Because of the disproportionate impact on women. So over 60% of job losses in Canada have been experienced by women. The rates of women now returning to work are slower than men. Women-dominated sectors, whether that's hospitality or retail, were some of the hardest hit. And of course, women are bearing the brunt of the rise of unpaid care work due to school, childcare closures. So I saw, I think, a study of the US yesterday saying about 25% of women are contemplating leaving careers because of childcare and such. So I think some of our concerns obviously is what is the impact on this women's economic insecurity as a direct result of the pandemic going to be on women's safety, not just now, but for this that's going to last for many years. And I think it's just really important to recognize that we can't address these two things in isolation. If we're looking at women's economic security, we also have to be looking at their safety and vice versa.
Thanks, Liren. And it's really not a surprise that as soon as the pandemic hit, a lot of services had to shift to an online presence. Forcibly so, to ensure that you're able to provide those services the best quality as you could prior to COVID-19. So Valentina, I want to ask you, just from an IHO perspective, has the online shift made things more difficult in how you're delivering or providing quality support to individuals, or has it been a positive experience in terms of the shift in how those support services are being delivered?
Yeah, so a little bit of both. So at first it was very difficult because even there's many services that were completely shut down, and we as a shelter, we do have staff on site that can help with many things, but we rely a lot to do referrals and outside agencies, and we all work together to meet all the needs that the women and the children have here at the shelter. So for sure, that's still an issue. It's most of the services are still just online. That works for some people. Other people, it doesn't work that much. Whenever I'm thinking of like the child services specifically, I know a lot of the women here are just, it doesn't work. Like children, it just doesn't work with them. Many parents are experiencing that right now with the homeschooling and e-learning. But something specifically that was very clear from us at the start was that some women didn't have the space or the capacity to step out and give us a call on our crisis calls or many of the other crisis lines that are available. So we partnered up with other organizations around Ottawa to create a new texting line. It's called Unsafe at Home. People are able to text us to get resources, to get emotional support, to see the availability of the shelter space. Instead of having to call every single shelter, you can just log on our texting line and see what that is like for the day. When I spoke to the staff members that are the ones dealing with the crisis text line, it definitely was a lot more of safety planning and emotional support because women were not able to leave their homes, whether it was because they just couldn't physically leave or there was no shelter space. Like I said, the shelter space has been a continuous problem, and we continue to work with the City of Ottawa to ensure that women and children have access to motels if they are in an unsafe situation. So the texting line has been great. We have partnered up with other rural areas around Ottawa to make sure that, because they really saw the same thing, so to make sure that they have access to either our texting line or they can create their own texting line. So we're working and partnering up with many organizations to make sure that we can still give the support that the women need, because we are very much aware that it does not, remote doesn't work for everybody, and some women just do not have the tools to be able to do the work online. Many families didn't have laptops. That's something too that we had to think about and work with women with them. So there's little pieces that if you're not in that position, you might not think about that you needed. So I'm really excited that our organization has been able to step in to kind of bridge some of these gaps in the system and in the services that are out there.
Thanks, Valentina. That's really great to hear. One is that not only have you witnessed the gap, but to provide a solution to kind of action out as part of support services. Thanks for sharing that. And that really kind of brings me to the next question that everyone has essentially mentioned is one of the biggest concerns has been raised during the pandemic is how are we going to support women who are with their abusers, who are in isolation with their abusers during the pandemic, many of whom, as Lyra and everyone else mentioned, have lost their jobs because that was essentially the hospitality industry. And several of you mentioned they may not have access to Wi-Fi or internet or online services, and they cannot, as Valentina, you put it, they may not be able to actually call because they're sharing the same roof as their abusers. So Valentina, you touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, how has IHO, of course, WomanACT and METRAC, how have you been addressing this concern? And what specific solutions have you put in place to ensure that the delivery of services could be on the same level as it were pre-COVID, or if not better, now that we're in COVID-19? Liren, if you want to get started.
Oh, sure. Well, I think we've heard a lot about the nature of the work with survivors has become more challenging and complex. I think is also, we need to recognize that the system was already extremely difficult to navigate pre-COVID. Like a lot of these issues that we're speaking about did exist already. So whether that was accessing, income support or housing, women have regularly been kind of required to prove or verify their abuse in order to access services or follow different rules and regulations in order to access services. So some of the work WomanACT has been doing is trying to work with programs and systems to actually make these processes a little bit easier and make them a little bit more accessible during this time. This might include kind of removing particular criteria or restrictions for services, or even allowing something as simple as allowing an application to be completed online, which in some cases for programs or housing we don't have yet, or allowing things to happen without signatures, or allowing a photo of a document rather than a copy of a document. So I think we have been hopeful in the sense that we've seen some services actually remove certain restrictions, and I think we need to recognize this, that Legal Aid Ontario has waived all financial eligibility for domestic violence survivors. That's a great foot forward. And one thing we're hoping at WomanACT is that we can show value in that when you lift these restrictions, when you actually make it easier for women to access services and supports, when you provide them with greater options, that more women will be coming forward, more women will be reporting, and of course, more women will be able to establish safety. And I think there can be sometimes this myth out there that if there aren't restrictions or if there aren't rules in place, people are going to start taking advantage of all these policies and programs, right? The scare tactic of there's fraud. Well, that isn't the case, and we know that. So some of the work we've been doing is trying to lift some of these restrictions, make options more available, make it easier, and hopefully advocate that these stay in place, post-COVID or after some of the things go back to, shall we call it normal or such.
Thanks, Liren. Paola.
Yeah, so during COVID-19, METRAC has tried to navigate these added challenges for our clients and potential clients, many of whom did not have access or technological access or the ability to reach out by connecting with our sister organizations to let them know that we're still operational and providing services. So we really utilize the strategy of word of mouth. METRAC, just as a backgrounder, works to end gender-based violence across communities through education, research, and policy. So our approach is to deliver relevant and boundary-breaking services and programs by focusing on education and prevention and the use of innovation tools to build safety, equity, and freedom. So not being a direct service provider, our approach was to continue to deliver things like our Family Law Education for Women program by utilizing our workshops, but offering them for free, and then using word of mouth to connect women with such workshops. We also had a system whereby we were actively taking calls to our METRAC offices and providing referrals to our sister organizations. And often, it was a situation where we would often need to provide a confidant to be able to provide a safe space for women to be called back at, because as I think Valentina had said, often the abuser was in the next room. And so relying on our sister organizations working together within the sector became invaluable for us at METRAC.
Yeah, I feel like with COVID-19, allyship has been one of the biggest biggest things that came out of pandemic, is for everyone to collaboratively work towards the same cause, which has been incredible to see. So I guess the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment has mentioned that Canada needs to develop a more clear definition of what economic abuse is to lay the groundwork for these policies and programs moving forward. So to this day, there isn't a definition that has been confirmed what economic abuse is, what falls under economic abuse, and it's been wonderful to kind of hear from all of you in terms of what should fall under it and what it means. Just out of curiosity, Neha, Liren, and Erin, are you aware of any countries that have clearly defined economic abuse, and how are they tackling this and addressing this within their nation and moving the agenda on economic abuse? Neha, if you want to kind of take this.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this really important question, because once a definition is set within a nation, that's where policies and programs can then follow. So it's really important. CCFWE specifically finds that the definition of economic abuse be included within domestic abuse, and that's one of the the pillars that we're working towards. To answer your question, we found that the UK has been quite forward-thinking in this aspect. They've included economic abuse as their official definition under domestic abuse, and it's simply not just included as an offset of elderly abuse. Most programs recognize economic abuse as something that happens within elder abuse, but elder abuse alone, and we're trying to expand that to include domestic abuse victims. So in the UK, we know that they've dedicated nonprofits to economic abuse, and they have filtered resources on their government websites as well, so people can educate themselves. But the nonprofits are very clear in their mandate. There's one called Surviving Economic Abuse and Women's Aid, of course. I think another really big benefit of this in the UK is that UK Finance, which is a collection of banks and financial institutions, they've created a task force specifically to identify and address financial abuse. And they've done this in collaboration with charities and victim support groups and government departments. And I think that's a really big step that they're taking that I think Canada needs to take. I would say that here, I know WomanACT has begun by making a big dent in this. They published a report on financial abuse in Hamilton, which was really significant. And here, our organization, CCFWE, is hoping to further this through education awareness, empowering domestic violence survivors by providing mental health and wellness services, entrepreneurship, advocacy and system change, and then also awareness. And we're hoping to launch a campaign in November in collaboration with other nonprofits. So I would stay tuned for that.
Correct. Thanks so much, Mia. Liren.
Sure. Yeah, just following up with Nia, you're absolutely right. Some countries have included economic abuse in their domestic violence legislation. This remains a gap, obviously, here in Canada. Considering family violence actually isn't indicated specifically in our criminal code here in Canada. We've got a bit of a ways to go, but there is, I know, provincial legislation related to domestic violence where economic abuse isn't captured. So I agree that that is definitely a step. As much as that is one step, I always say it's, you know, in addition to having things acknowledged and defined, it's not very useful unless you've got actions attached to that, and the actions aren't very useful unless you have funding attached to that. So what we really need to see, obviously, is actions and funding dedicated towards that. You know, in the Throne from the Speech from the Throne last week, a national action plan on gender-based violence was mentioned. I think that's a really good opportunity for us to get in there and ensure that economic and financial abuse is identified and recognized, and some strategies are put towards it. I just want to add too, in addition to kind of this economic abuse between partners and ex-partners, we've also spoke about these systems and policies, right, that reinforce women's economic insecurity and that they put women in situations of economic dependence. So in addition to it being defined and acknowledged, I think, you know, there's such a need also to analyze our policies and look at ways in which this is being reinforced, because you can have all of the programs and policies and supports in place, but if our systems and policies are reinforcing these conditions, we're already going to always be hitting this systemic wall. So an example of that is, you know, under social assistance policy in Ontario, the definition of a spouse is 3 months for cohabitation. That means if you're living with someone in Ontario for 3 months and you're receiving social assistance, you're then sharing finances. And we know that these checks are defaulted to the man usually. So this diminishes women's economic independence and control. And so I think that if we're really looking at that systemic approach to it, whether it's through definition or policy, we also have to look at how existing policies are reinforcing it, right? Another example is our immigration policy in Canada. Across all routes to permanent residency in Canada, women are more likely to gain permanent residency as a dependent spouse. Right? Yeah, this in effect can support the power imbalances between women and men, and it, you know, it really does reinforce their insecurity. So while I think that legislation is so important, we also need to look at existing legislation and understanding how are they reinforcing these dangerous norms that we're trying to prevent, and how are they, you know, perpetuating women's economic insecurity, because it doesn't just come between partner and ex-partner, right? It comes also from our own systems and policies.
Yeah, thanks so much for highlighting that, Liren, because I think that's also a shift in the mindset as well, is that as you mentioned, if there is a clear definition, or even prior to coming up with a clear definition, let's kind of evaluate the policies that have been put in place prior to moving something forward and seeing how things can be actioned out. So thanks so much for pointing that out. Sorry, Erin.
Great. Yeah, so just to add to the points that have been made, I think that, I mean, we are seeing with the revisions to the Divorce Act that happened somewhat recently, financial abuse was included as a form of family violence. And so there is a definition there, but of course, and I mean, that's a great positive step, but it's limited to people who are looking to get divorced, and so obviously doesn't capture all of the different situations where people may be experiencing economic abuse and need that type of protection. I think to build on what Liren was just saying too, is that thinking about addressing economic abuse through a human rights lens and looking at human rights conventions and instruments that identify an economic rights as one of our basic human rights is also a really important thing to be thinking about as we're talking about definitions and understanding that ensuring that these protections are offered. So with work on the National Action Plan to address gender-based violence, you know, there is a real call for that to take a human rights-based approach to ensure that when we're talking about protecting people from all forms of gender-based violence, we're recognizing that that is a human right. So those would just be two pieces that I would add to that discussion.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I wanted to point out with this isolation and COVID-19, kind of shift gears that has been incredibly alarming and concerning, is a lack of data that has been collected and how individuals have been disproportionately impacted during this time. And I don't know about you, but it's certainly been very frustrating. And I believe Stats Canada not long ago released an online survey on discrimination during COVID-19, but it's an online survey, so not everyone is able to access and have their say. It's not as inclusive as it could be. So how is CCFWE, EVA-CAN, WomanACT, METRAC, how are you spearheading this gap of kind of the lack of data that we have right now? So Paola, if you want to kind of kickstart this for us.
Yeah, it's been a challenge. So as we know, COVID-19 reached Toronto about 6-7 months ago in March, and METRAC, essentially, we've been working to stabilize our services in which we've been mandated to carry out. And so for us, data collection may come later. It's too early in our case, essentially because of our mandated programs and the funds that are needed to do this data collection. So it's been incredibly challenging from our end. We would very much like to get to the stage of data collection because it is so essential for our work that we're doing, but it may come later, to be perfectly honest. Yeah.
Liren?
Sure. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think gears shifted in March and priorities, new priorities. We saw WomanACT has been collecting data from service providers throughout the pandemic in different forms. And over the past couple months, we've started collecting data now with women because we recognize that we need to ensure that any data collection efforts are not putting women at greater risk. And so the methods that we traditionally use, whether it's through primary research or through our ongoing data collection, we've had to readjust those and understand what data collection really does mean during this time, and what will it mean not just for their safety, but also that we're not putting more burden on women and more burden on their time, right? And that this is meaningful, and not just around data, but how do we continue to engage them in research and policy and planning right now in a meaningful way without putting too much burden on. One thing I would just say is one of the initiatives that WomanACT is undertaking is we're trying to form, over the next few months, we're forming a data working group in kind of the GTA area, if anyone's interested, really just to identify needs, improve collaboration, and build capacity, because we do see it as a need. And really, we need data on understanding the impact of the pandemic and understanding where we're at so that we can prepare, plan, response, and plan a response that is based on evidence. So just a shout out, anyone can get in touch if they're interested in that.
Thanks, Liren. Neha?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks, Liren, for letting us know about the working group. I think we'd definitely be interested in that. I also just want to start off by saying that historically, when it comes to lockdowns like this, during things like natural disasters or hurricanes or pandemics like Ebola in West Africa, data is usually typically the first thing to drop off. Understandably, because everything goes into emergency mode, but often it's something that's most important, especially when it comes to women's issues and gender-based violence, because gender-based violence are the things that are likely to increase in lockdowns such as this one, or such as one in a hurricane, or as I was saying, the Ebola virus, but it's typically the one that's most ignored. So on that end, CCFWE, we're in the midst of finalizing a national quantitative and qualitative survey that we're hoping to disseminate soon in October. To get an idea of how victims of domestic abuse and economic abuse have been faring during COVID. And we're hoping to reach this list of survivors, not just through online methods, but we've been hosting weekly webinars for free for domestic abuse survivors. So we hope to reach them through that and through our partnerships and collaborations through nonprofits. So if there are, again, another shout out to anybody who's on this call, anybody who'd like to work with us to help disseminate the survey, like I said, Liren would love to be a part of that data working group because I think it would help us get that out. And we're also just trying to stem the gap as much as possible, not just reaching out to maybe shelters or domestic abuse organizations, but through other organizations to reach individuals who may slip through the cracks, like Indigenous women, people in LGBTQ communities, and visible minorities, and immigrants and refugees. So again, that's coming in October.
Great. Can't wait to look at that report. And yeah, Liren, anything I could do? That's actually awesome that there is a data working group. I'm really, really amazed or pleased to hear about that. Erin.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And I agree that it's an important time for collecting data, but a really challenging time for doing that. And as I said, EVA Canada, in partnership with Innova, did conduct a survey over the summer, and we have a report posted on our website at endingviolencecanada.org. And our survey, it was an online survey available in French and English, and we heard back from 376 gender-based violence service providers or volunteers across the country. And the survey asked questions related to, the nature of the changes that they were needing to make in their organizations, the changes that they were noticing in terms of the nature of violence that survivors who use their services were experiencing, and the challenges in help seeking that they were perceiving. So we didn't connect directly with service users or survivors, but got the service providers' perspectives of those challenges as a way to kind of get around some of those data challenges right now, or data collection challenges. And then we asked people about, what they thought was necessary, what government was missing about what was needed to respond to the pandemic. One of the things, just to build on what you were saying, Neha, is that when we asked service providers to identify the type of organization they were working at, we certainly found that people weren't just responding from shelters or sexual assault centers, that we did hear from people working in settlement services, Indigenous organizations, a bunch of different types of organizations, which tells us that gender-based violence service provision is happening in a lot of different spaces right now, and that again can be challenging when we're trying to get a really comprehensive picture. I think also there's been a lot of, it's also about kind of thinking about the different ways that we can share information. So there have been a lot of webinars and information sharing calls. I know that I've been a part of. We organized a call for frontline, for people who are working on the front lines in responding to sexual violence. So sexual violence centers and services across the country to to hear about the specific challenges that that part of the gender-based violence sector was facing. And although of course that wasn't a formal data collection process, it really provided a way right now for people to kind of get a sense of what was happening across the country, and to kind of identify some of the key challenges and just share information and ideas, which I think is what's really important right now and why we want some of this research to be done. And so we do have that webinar posted on our website as well, with a summary of the key points that came from that. And I know a number of other organizations like OCASI has done a number of those webinars as well and posted some of the kind of findings emerging from those discussions. And I think right now those are really important and useful resources, because this is such a situation also where we want this information really quickly to inform our advocacy and the supports that we're offering to survivors. So.
Thanks, Erin. I think what was really wonderful is that you brought out, I think the key term is information sharing. I think it's so important, especially now, to see how organizations are tackling this and how can organizations collaborate and work together as allies to generate more data and cultivate resources towards moving the agenda on this. So thank you so much for bringing up that point. Valentina, not to put you on the spot, but are you aware of kind of any steps that IHO is taking specifically in this, in kind of bridging the gap in this, in terms of data collection with IHO?
So we are always partnering up with other organizations that are collecting data from many different services. We try to have a intersectional lens when we're talking about this. So also focusing on Indigenous women, refugees and immigrants, all of these, because whenever we are collecting data, these are the groups that you don't typically see as much. So trying to make sure that those voices are going to be heard when we are collecting data is very important. They have additional barriers that somebody that was Canadian born might not have in some of these issues. So for sure, making those connections. I would love to be part of any of the data collection in our organization. Will be more than happy to help, because it's such an important part of the process. If we are trying to gather data, we can make sure that we know what is needed in the community. As somebody that's working with the women face to face, I can obviously see some patterns, and I see some things that obviously stick out to me, but it's really important that we have the data to back it up, and it's not just things that we see as an organization. Most of the times those do end up being part of the findings, but just to make sure that it is backed up by that data, so we can later implement programs that will be tackling those specific issues to make sure that every single woman, different types of women, again, that intersectional lens is so important to us here at IHO, because we have all types of women that come into the shelter that need support. So we really want to make sure that we are supporting every single one of them in whatever it is that they need.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Valentina. So I just wanted to kind of pull or extract some of the wording. This is actually from the 2019 WomanACT study. Just about abuse, and unlike just about kind of a form of economic abuse, where it was mentioned that unlike physical abuse, financial abuse often continues long after a woman has left the abusive relationship, because their abuser can maintain contact and control through spousal or child support. Coerced debt and bad credit scores often prevent survivors from securing housing in short and long terms, or make it more difficult to get a credit card, student loan, line of credit, and car loan, and potentially a job due to screening by some employers. It's certainly been touched on by all of you during this conversation. And I think it's very important, and I feel like this particular paragraph touched on a lot of different spectrums in how it can impact women on so many different levels. So just to kind of, I want to put this out there, how can external organizations, and yeah, you kind of touched on this from what the UK is doing, including our government and other external organizations like financial institutions, play a key role in one, flagging economic abuse, and of course, supporting victims and survivors of economic abuse as well. I guess, Paola, if you want to kickstart this, would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the most important things a financial institution can begin to do is to start training its employees on recognizing the signs and patterns of financial abuse in a customer. So noticing some of the red flags of abuse can trigger a banker, for instance, to begin to ask the right questions and provide direct support. So for instance, if a woman comes into a bank because her bank accounts have been drained by an abusive partner, it's important for the banker to know to open a new account in her name only, and to begin to start to talk about encouraging things like savings, budgeting, debit card and credit card PIN safety as part of the survival plan and safety plan. And I think it's essential for a banker to know when to provide the contact information of agencies such as the Credit Counseling Agency of Canada to help a woman who may be experiencing bad debt as a result of credit being taken out in her own name. So similarly, from a violence prevention measure, I think bank employees also play a really important role in facilitating and encouraging healthy financial relationships when meeting with a new couple. So I think it's important to include things like asking a couple if they would like separate or joint bank accounts, and explaining and sort of going through the details of what that actually means and what the responsibilities entail. I think it's important to discuss things like budgeting with your banker as a couple. And I also think that explaining and understanding what it means for both parties to do things like sign a loan or a mortgage in a relationship. So I think both the capacity building strategy for financial institutions and really working with employees, I think, is a key part. I think it's a personal thing for me as well, just because I am a previous banker and have been part of the financial institutions. And so when I've been working and navigating the system of banks, I've seen that this is a gap area, and I feel that it's really essential to begin to instill those skills in bankers.
Thanks, Paola. Just out of curiosity, just with regard to financial aid, is there financial aid available right now for victims of financial abuse or economic abuse, especially during COVID-19, if they've been laid off or anything? Just out of curiosity, none. Yeah.
I don't think so. I think some of my colleagues here on the line may know of any, but from my perspective, I'm not aware of any.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Liren.
Sure. Yeah, I know those are all excellent points. I agree on all of those. As part of our research, we asked both survivors. We also asked stakeholders such as VAW organizations and financial institutions what they saw some of the solutions, and you're absolutely right. We also heard about the need for partnerships across financial institutions and VAW and other support agencies, so that capacity building and those support could be in place. We heard for training, as Paul mentioned, not only in banks, but in VAW sector agencies or other agencies, and the need to include financial abuse and risk assessment and safety planning early on so that it can be identified. Also, as you mentioned, the thing we heard the most from survivors was related to coerced debt and the impact on credit rating. So there is a need for free credit counseling and debt remediation services, but there's also, we need actual just flexible, interest-free, realistic debt repayment plans. You can go to all the counseling, that isn't removing anything, and actually interest can be building. We also need emergency funds for women available who are fleeing violence, right? And it comes back to this policy piece again. In Ontario, yes, you can apply for social assistance when you're fleeing violence, but it has an asset eligibility. So many women are left giving up their savings, their car, other assets they have when already faced with financial hardship. So sometimes what is required is those emergency funds, knowing that when a woman is more financially independent, she's more likely to flee violence and remain safe. So I think that's also important.
Thanks, Liren. Neha.
I think everyone's already touched on the major points that I was thinking about. I would only say that just like Liren said earlier, financial institutions often do reinforce economic abuse on the survivors. sometimes even when they're trying to get out of that situation. For example, like a lot of domestic abuse survivors, when they leave their partner, are still able to find their partner through information that the financial institution gives out, even though like they may have already been told, you know, like this person is fleeing a domestically violent situation. So just like Paola said, is to re-examine their own policy and train staff to make sure that they can identify those flags. And just like Liren said, to provide accessible and free credit repair and debt remediation services, but also to increase financial literacy programs and financial empowerment, but with a trauma-informed approach, because often these women in these situations, they don't necessarily have the capacity to attend all of these financial literacy programs or anything like that. So they need to be quite trauma-informed. And just like Liren said again, affordable checking and savings account, it seems like a fairly basic thing, but it's something that plagues women a lot. A lot of these women end up being bankrupt. Just an anecdote from our, or not an anecdote, but a personal story from our own CE, that our systems themselves are not reinforcing economic abuse or reinforcing anxiety-inducing situations for these women who are coming out. For example, like part of our survey, we did a literature review of situations like this, where it was found that in the US and in Canada, often women who went into get services were often reminded of their trauma when they were with their abusive partner, because often they're sometimes neglected by the system. And I think once we have that definition, I think it would become more recognizable within the systems that we have themselves. But like Liren said, I just want to reiterate that the definition itself won't be enough. Like, we have to take definite action to look at our systems, look at all of our policies and programs when it comes to social services, and revamp them.
Thanks, Nia. Liren.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, these are all great points. So the other thing I would add that we haven't really mentioned, and I am not someone to usually advocate for the government to raise awareness on things, because I always think that's a bit of an easy way out on things, particularly gender-based violence. However, there is a need in Canada to raise awareness on economic abuse and financial abuse, because it's so hidden. And as I started off, I think, by saying, because there's this gray area that's wrapped up in gendered and traditional norms, we need to start having those discussions in our community around what is financial abuse? What does financial abuse feel like for this person and this other person? And what is that, how is that impacting you? You know, one thing I always find quite incredible, surprising, but also not surprising, is when we do put out a piece, particularly on financial abuse compared to other things, we get a lot more calls. So, you know, I think we had a piece in the Globe one day, and the next day I received about 35 phone calls from women who had read the piece and said, I think I'm experiencing this. I hadn't really identified it as abuse. You know, we don't talk about it. It's taboo to talk about family, to even talk about money in my home, etc. So while I, you know, don't normally put raising awareness at the top of an ask list, I think it could be on the list here for ask for government, because of this complexity and this kind of the intersectional gendered family taboo complexity to it. I think there is some need to start talking about it in our communities.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Liren. I think we mentioned that right in the beginning as well when we started this discussion, is the awareness piece, is the not knowing what it is, and individuals going through economic abuse without realizing that it is economic abuse. So thanks so much for pointing that out. Erin, Valentina, Paola, anything you'd like to add in?
Sure.
Go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, I would just say I think all of these points are excellent, and I think to just add to that is also to be thinking about what are the systemic policy changes that we can also be thinking about that are going to improve women's economic security, independence, and equality overall, so that there's less vulnerability when it comes to experiencing economic abuse and financial abuse. So that's where really thinking about how things like a guaranteed basic income is really important, where, you know, the government's commitment in the speech from the throne to universal early learning housing and childcare system is connected to women's economic equality and their ability to protect themselves from economic abuse. Things like having accessible and affordable housing is another important way to address some of these root causes. Thinking about actually taking action on the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is part of, again, addressing this issue of economic abuse and financial abuse that's experienced by Indigenous women and girls. So I think that also creating that systemic support for women so that they can experience more economic security and equality is a really big part of this conversation as well.
Thanks, Erin. Valentina?
Yeah, so I was going to touch on Lyra's point about awareness. So I definitely experience the same thing when women come into the shelter. They do not think of economic abuse as one of the types of abuse that they were going through. Very quickly, once we go through our intake, the banking is one section of it, because it's very important for us to be able to separate all of these things so the women can be financially independent moving forward. Another thing that I usually find with women is that if they are receiving social assistance from the government, so OW or ODSP, many of them don't actually know what they are entitled to. Many of their caseworkers, and totally on their fault because their caseloads are insanely ridiculous. They don't have time to sit down and explain to each one of their clients what they're actually entitled to. So that is something that we work with the women a lot to make sure that they are receiving all the funds that they are entitled to. There are emergency funds that women are entitled to, but that they don't know about. And I hate to say it, but some of the times it does take another professional to call that caseworker to be the one to advocate for the women and be like, no, these are things that they're entitled to. They're not like they need it, especially when it comes to COVID. It's very important that women have all the access to the money that they need. Something in the community that I don't particularly deal with because I deal with the women that are in the shelter, but many of our transitional support workers that work with women in the community have heard many of these stories, women that have been forced to apply to serve when they know that they're not eligible, but their partner forced them to apply. That has a huge financial consequence on their taxes and their files and everything in the future. Women that have never been in debt before are now in debt and have their credit cards maxed out because they lost their job and their partner lost their job, and now they're the ones that carry that financial burden for the household. Many, because of the types of abuse that they experience, control over finances obviously is one of the main ones. So many of the time they didn't even see that check from OW or ODSP. Their partner was the one that spent it all. So making sure that women know what they are entitled to and what their rights are when it comes to services as well, it's really important to us because we want to make sure that we advocate for them, but also that they know that they can advocate for themselves for something that they're entitled to.
All right. Thanks so much, Valentina. Paula, is there anything you'd like to add in?
Everyone has shared excellent points. I think the only thing I could add was to sort of build on this whole awareness generation piece and the concepts and the definitions of economic abuse. And I think one of the gap areas is within our education system. So I think launching all of the terminology, the concepts, starting from a very young age, I think is essential. Particularly from a young age, and the curriculums in the schools, I think, really need a revamp in terms of integrating not only this definition, but action and what this may look like and what the implications and consequences of economic abuse are. That's the only point that I think I would add.
Great point.
Yeah, that was great, Paul. It's really, great to highlight that it has to happen really early on, and not as an action to or a result of having the literacy be a result of something, but have it be more of a proactive solution to this. So thanks so much for pointing that out. So just looking at my time, we are actually right on. I think we're at 31. This has been amazing. I've learned so much from all of you. This has been great and a great learning experience for me that I can certainly take back to my community, which is really wonderful. So I'm just looking at the Q&A. It looks like we have couple of questions here from an audience member. So just wanted to kind of read it out loud, and feel free to jump in, whoever, would be great. So this is, I believe, essentially is a comment. So are there any comments on temporary foreign workers, their insecurity and the conflict between their health and safety during COVID and financial pressure to secure a job? Whoever would like to take that one. No?
Well, I guess I can just make a general comment that I think, temporary foreign workers are certainly a group who are experiencing additional risks right now during COVID-19 because it's more challenging to maybe access supports and healthcare that's necessary that they might need. They may be working in more precarious situations or doing some of that essential care work that's happening right now, that it can be, challenging. There can be those additional barriers and challenges. And I think that when we're thinking about how the pandemic is impacting all of us, but just remembering again that it's impacting people in different ways. So I think that that's probably a part of the conversation that we haven't been talking about enough and haven't been hearing about enough in terms of those distinct challenges that are emerging for temporary foreign workers. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Yeah, and I think outside of COVID, even more generally speaking, right, looking at, once again, immigration policy and understanding, the caregivers program has changed over the past few years, some in great ways, others in not great ways, right? They did a lot of advocacy recognizing that the caregiver program, which is predominantly women, it's made up of proportionally women, we're experiencing different forms of abuse and economic abuse. And while some changes have been made to that, they change other parts of that policy where they've now put a cap on permanent residency. That's the only economic program that has a cap on permanent residency, and it's majority women. So I think it's just getting back to, that's why particular immigration programs and policies need to have that intersectional gender lens applied to it, so we can understand how it's impacting different groups' safety as well as their economic well-being. Absolutely.
Thanks, Lauren. So just another question here. So if you could talk more about what can be done when women are sponsored by their spouses to become permanent residents and they have to be dependent on their spouses. Anyone? There you go. Neha, sorry, I'm just volunteering you for this.
No, it's great. I believe that, it's always a difficult situation. It's much like the temporary foreign situation where because a woman doesn't have a permanent status here, they need to, they can't access all of the resources that are offered to other Canadian-born citizens. In terms of what can be done on the ground, I'm going to admit that it's not my area of expertise, but I believe that there are ways, different shelters, organizations here, and nonprofits that would be able to assist them, especially if you go to some of the immigrant and refugee centers. They have the ability to access those services that you wouldn't be able to access as a Canadian-born citizen. But I'm hoping someone else can jump in and help me on this one.
Sure.
Because it is a good question.
Jump in. Yeah, I think more short term, there are groups advocating right now for expedited routes for those in sponsored relationships who are experiencing abuse. So expedited routes into permanent residency through different means or through the agency application. We do need greater services for women without status, obviously. But we also need to ensure that those services are safe, right? Because there are services that are available, and there's still a lot of fear around accessing them, rightfully so, because of a fear of being reported. I think more generally, getting back to my kind of other messages I've made, you know, we do need to look at immigration policy more generally. Why is it that women gain permanent residency more so through sponsored programs? It's because our immigration policies don't value traditionally women's work, right? We put more value on employment or work that is traditionally done by men. And that's why our economic routes are filled with men coming into the country and not women. So I think that it is also stepping back and looking at what are those economic routes? What are those routes that we can create so that women can immigrate to Canada as economically independent and not dependent on a spouse?
Yeah, so I can add to that. So definitely it is a complicated process to separate your application from your spouse, but it is possible and women can do it. You do not have to stay in the relationship, and they do not have to continue to rely on their partner. They do have to access an organization. So one of the things that we do is we give women a certificate for a 2-hour free legal advice. So they can go to a lawyer, and the lawyer can actually explain to them in very specific detail what are the steps to do it. Of somebody that has to deal with a lot of these things, even for me, it's so difficult to understand, like, legal terms and all of these things are very difficult for a person that doesn't know English, or maybe English is just not their strongest language. Is going to be almost impossible for them to do it on their own. So definitely reach out to organizations, whether it be a VAW or immigrant and refugee organizations, and they do have the tools and the services to help women. But absolutely, that is one of the fear tactics that many abusers use, is having their status as one of the things that they're going to report. Just so everybody also knows, interval house, that's not one of our requirements. Anybody can access the shelter regardless of where your status is in Canada. And from here, we help you get a status that is going to help you stay here and make sure that we're meeting every single one of your needs. And immigration is definitely one of them that we deal with on a pretty frequent basis.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that resource, Valentina. So is there a generational aspect, i.e. children continuing the abuse as they have been told that mom has all the money from child support, etc., and the child is told that it is more and they are entitled by the other parent? Would you like for me to reread that? Sorry, just wanted to see. Yeah, okay. Is there a generational aspect, i.e. children continuing the abuse as they have been told that mom has all the money from child support, etc., and the child is told that it is more and they are entitled by the other parent? So from what I gathered, it's the child or the children are being told one thing by mom and another thing by dad or their partner. Yeah. How to handle this, I think, is what was the question was. Yeah.
Well, I can hop in just to say, I think that's a common example of how abuse continues after a separation, right? That it isn't just financial abuse, that's emotional abuse. There was a really interesting piece, I think it was in the Star last week, about this, around kind of parental alienation and how kind of ex-abusers can, or abusers or ex-partners can carry on abuse through children. So I think that I'm not quite sure I have a solution necessarily for it, but I think we need to identify that as that's just another form of abuse that's coming from the ex-partner, but being the child is being used as a part of it.
Yeah.
I think I would also add that this is speaking to intergenerational trauma, right? It sort of is building of the trauma. And I think it's very, in looking at the whole picture and the whole solutions that come with that in terms of working with counselors, social workers, and therapists who may be able to support a family or parenting through this from a trauma-informed approach.
Thanks, Noah.
And just to say, I know Erin mentioned it before, if people are interested in this, there is work being done obviously on the Divorce Act right now. I know Luke's Place in Durham is doing some campaigning around how to have domestic violence, intimate partner violence better recognized and acknowledged within the Divorce Act through language. And this is a piece around it, right? How that abuse continues and how can we prevent that? How can we address that through existing systems of child protection, child support, child custody. So there's conversations happening about this right now. Just to say.
Thanks for sharing that, Lauren. Is there sorry, that was the next question. How to deal with the perception that independent economic existence of a woman is not warranted? How to break the social norm that a woman is always provided for?
It's a tough one. I think that hits at the social aspect, like how our society views women and the relationship between men and women. Things like that are always very tough to combat because it's something that's so ingrained from generation to generation. There are even things like, I mean, coming from a South Asian background, I know that that's definitely the kind of notion that we have in our heads. And I know a lot of women who don't know that they're just suffering from economic abuse, that they're just like, oh, you know, like this is just how it is. My husband just deals with this kind of stuff and I don't have any say in it. But I think being able to deal with that again are things that we've mentioned already. Number one, the awareness aspect for people to know what the term is and how it impacts people. So at an individual level, you can know yourself what economic abuse is and how to identify that that's something that I'm going through. Number two, I would say again, coming at it from the policy and program side, but just as Paola said, the education side, like hitting this in high schools or in middle schools or educating on that level is something that a child can take with them into adulthood or be able to identify that within their own family relationships. I think that's probably the way to go about it best. And then on the individual level, having that awareness yourself, being prepared to be an ally to somebody who you might think or might suspect might be going into this kind of a situation and might need that kind of help.
Thanks so much, Neha. I think one of the things that really kind of sparked in me what you said and what all of you said as well is the awareness piece, but also the education piece. I think the other kind of key element to all of this is also easy to access information. Because I mean, I come from an immigrant family and I knew what it was like to kind of not be able to easily find information. My parents were really kind of struggling to figure out, you know, how can we kind of, what are our next steps going to be? And it was a lot of unknown, but yeah, so certainly, yeah, it was great to kind of hear about, yes, the educational, the awareness side, but certainly on the accessibility side so that all information can be easily, of course, accessed as well. So I believe our very last question here, are there any new tools or best practices suggested for strengthening safety planning with a woman experiencing economic abuse, particularly immigrants and refugees? They often express feeling stuck in their situations and resources are limited.
So my advice is always to access an organization, because even as somebody that works within the service as a service provider, I have to keep up with so much information when it comes to like specific things that are COVID responses from the government. we had to keep up with that all summer, and it was really difficult for us. So I can only imagine as somebody that's just reading it and trying to figure it out, it is absolutely difficult. So reach out to the organizations that are around. Even if that specific organization is not what you're looking for, they will give you a referral to an organization that will. So don't be afraid to ask. Our crisis line is not only for emotional support and shelter space. We also give you referral to other agencies that you may not know about. So ours is for the Ottawa area specifically, but really you can call any of your VAW support services shelters themselves. They will be able to tell you what you can do. They will do a safety plan with you. Anybody that calls us and they want a safety plan, I can do a safety plan with them over the phone. It is a little bit more difficult, but we will make it work. So definitely don't be afraid to reach out to organizations. That's what we are here for. And we want to be able to help as many people as possible, but it does take the initial you getting in contact with us.
Thanks, Valentina. Does anyone like to add to that? Nope.
I think if you just in terms of economic abuse, we've done a bit of work around kind of often people want very, we spoke about large system solutions and looking for practical solutions. And something that we found that survivors have said were useful is being more informed. And by that, I mean, it's not so much that the actual information is powerful, but if a partner, ex-partner is gaslighting you around finances or money, if you've gone and shown that you've actually done the research there, I've heard that, from survivors that could support other things, make copies, store financial documents in a safe space or with someone else, get into a bank and open your own bank account, request a free credit report so you're aware of your credit, access a free credit counseling service in your community, they are there. And another big one that we often hear has been successful is visit your bank, or at this point, call your bank, I suppose, and ask questions. Ask questions about what accounts are in your name, how much are those accounts, what are on those accounts, do you have credit cards in your name, are they joint? What does joint actually mean, in the sense that some joint accounts someone can actually leave and enclose it, other joint accounts you can't. So, get into a bank and ask those questions and really understand. I think we could all benefit from that, right? So there's a lot of information to be had.
Lauren,
yeah, sorry,
sorry about that. If I could just add, I think in accessing the bank, I think it's also very important to know, as you were saying, Sonia, that the language is a very important component of this. So knowing things like the banks offer services in various languages, and being able to call in to ask for a various language also becomes very important in this process of knowing and being informed. So I think that's also very key.
Yeah, I think definitely from aiding, this would definitely, Paul and everyone else mentioned this, is in the role that financial institutions can play in preemptively flagging things like this happening ahead of time as well, that would aid an individual's case towards this. So yeah, great points. Yeah. Sorry, Neha, you look like you wanted to add something.
Oh, no, I'm okay.
Oh, okay. So I just have one question here. I believe it's from one of the viewers. So do you have access to a community health clinic? They're often very helpful for individuals that do not have a family doctor. I'm not sure if this is part of another question, but I don't know who that is. Oh, sorry, Valentina, Valentina, is that your question to Edna? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that was my response.
Sorry. Okay. All right, sorry, my bad. Sorry about that. Well, it looks like these are all the questions. These were actually very wonderful, and the questions were amazing as well. And I, speaking for myself, have learned so much, and I'm really, really thrilled to be allies with incredible organizations to working towards this. So I do want to thank all of you for saying yes to this very important topic. And my hope is that this conversation really spearheads hundreds more conversations and work towards moving the agenda on economic abuse. So thank you all for joining this conversation. And I just wanted to do a quick shout out. Thanks to Startup Canada for kind of making this happen through Zoom. But yeah, so in the meantime, what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing some contact information on all of our speakers if you'd like to reach out to them as well, who can help navigate you to resources that their organizations, their wonderful organizations, are making available to everyone. And yeah, any questions, feel free to let me know, but I'm really, really happy with this discussion this afternoon, and let's work together and making this happen. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Have a wonderful
Thank you.
week.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.